Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world that smelled faintly of smoke, oil, and wet straw. A place where kings wore furs in summer and peasants thought soap was suspicious. You're stepping into medieval Europe, where rules weren't just weird. They were survival tactics wrapped in superstition. You probably wouldn't survive this one, so consider this your warning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time down below. It's fun to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the muddy streets of a 14th century town. The air is thick with the smell of tallow candles, roast onions, and something less charming: human life without plumbing. You might think the first thing you'd want here is a bath, but not so fast. Taking one too often could actually get you side-eyed or even scolded by a priest. See, back then, the idea of hygiene was flipped on its head. People honestly believed water opened up the pores, tiny doorways for diseases to sneak in. Physicians of the day swore that warm baths weakened the flesh. One famous French medical text literally warned, "Those who bathe frequently grow soft and die young." So the rule was simple: don't bathe unless absolutely necessary. And if you must, make sure to perfume afterward to seal the body. Imagine dabbing rosewater instead of deodorant and calling it medicine. You'd fit right in. But the irony: bathhouses were still everywhere, especially before the Black Death hit. Only, they weren't quite about hygiene anymore. By the 1200s, bathhouses had turned into social clubs. And let's just say, not everyone went there to scrub. That's why, by the 14th century, towns across Europe started shutting them down. Moral panic mixed with plague paranoia turned bubbly evenings into sin zones. Still, historians argue whether medieval people were truly dirty. Some evidence shows nobles owned combs, mirrors, and even toothpicks carved from silver. One English knight's will listed half a dozen scented soaps among his treasures. Clearly, some cared about appearances. Others, though, leaned hard into grime. Dirt meant humility. Monks even bragged about their holy filth. Picture this: you're a pilgrim returning from the Holy Land, your tunic stiff with road dust. A local innkeeper offers a tub of warm water, steam curling up from the fire. You hesitate. The priest's sermon still rings in your ears. Bathing tempts the flesh. You decide to skip it, mumbling that your soul's cleaner than your feet. Congratulations, you've just followed medieval health advice. But there were exceptions. After plagues or during Lent, public authorities might force a cleansing, ironically, to purify souls more than bodies. Royal physicians often prescribed herbal steam baths for melancholy or gout. And nobles, of course, bent rules as they pleased. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly took only 2 baths in her life. Meanwhile, her husband Ferdinand supposedly bathed whenever he pleased. Typical double standard. Here's a funny one in some French cities. Barbers doubled as bath attendants. You could get a haircut, bloodletting, and a quick dunk all in one visit. Talk about an early spy day, medieval style. The barber's pole even comes from that practice. White for bandages, red for blood. Relaxing, right? Still, the average villager's bath was a wooden bucket behind the house. Once a week if lucky, once a season if not. Soap was made from animal fat and ashes, So your hands ended up feeling like sandpaper. And water had to be fetched, heated, and reused. So if you were last in the family lineup, your bathwater had character. Some monasteries did promote cleanliness, though. The Benedictine rule from the 6th century required monks to wash their hands before meals and feet before bed. But it didn't specify how often full baths were allowed, probably because water was heavy and cold, and someone had to haul it by hand. Interestingly, after the Black Death mid-1300s, fear of infection skyrocketed. People started believing that disease was transmitted through miasma, bad air that clung to damp skin. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs to block it. Bathing, they thought, invited miasma straight into your bloodstream. So ironically, the cleaner you got, the sicker they thought you'd become. One London proclamation in 1383 warned citizens against excessive washing, claiming it made them weak of spirit. You can almost picture the medieval version of a health influencer saying, "Skip your bath. It's self-care." Of course, the reality was different in the East. Islamic and Byzantine societies valued cleanliness deeply, associating it with spiritual purity. Public baths in cities like Baghdad and Constantinople were architectural marvels. Steam domes, mosaics, perfumed oils. A traveler from Damascus once described Europe as a land of cold water and unwashed faith. Ouch. But remember, every weird rule had a reason. With no understanding of germs and limited access to clean water, washing really could make you sick. Rivers were open sewers, wells overflowed with waste, and soap often contained lye strong enough to burn skin. So maybe, just maybe, avoiding too many baths wasn't totally irrational. Let's not forget that medieval people masked odor in creative ways. Lavender sachets sewn into clothing, orange peels tucked under caps, and vinegar-soaked cloths waved before the nose on hot days. Imagine walking through a crowd that smells like a mixture of church incense, goat leather, and fermented cabbage. That's your new perfume line. By the 1500s, etiquette books even advised people to wash their hands upon rising and before dining, hinting at early hygiene reform. But that was centuries later. For most of the Middle Ages, the rule stood firm: stay dry, stay safe, and if anyone accuses you of smelling, quote scripture and say it's divine protection. And as silly as it sounds now, that superstition saved lives during plague years. When public baths became infection hotspots, those who avoided them had better odds. Sometimes, weird, rules aged surprisingly well. There's a kind of coziness to this idea, though. Accepting imperfection as virtue. Picture yourself under a rough wool blanket in a timber cottage, rain drumming the thatch. Your feet are filthy. Your hair smells like wood smoke, but the world feels steady. Maybe that's the secret medieval comfort. No pressure to look perfect. Of course, not everyone agreed. A few early doctors started to challenge the no-bath logic. By the late 14th century, scholars at the University of Montpellier debated whether moderate washing might actually strengthen the body. Historians still argue whether this marked the beginning of Europe's slow return to soap and sanity. So as you drift further into this sleepy timeline, remember, if you were alive then, skipping your shower wasn't laziness, it was obedience. You'd have been following medical advice, moral law, and social code all at once. And who knows, maybe tonight's medieval ancestors are nodding in ghostly approval, while you tuck in, clean and fragrant. Because once the candlelight fades and the chill settles in, there's a strange comfort in knowing even the strangest rules. Like, don't bathe too often, had their reasons. You just have to imagine them through the lens of fear-faith, and a world where clean could mean dangerous. The next time someone tells you to wash up, you can whisper, "Not tonight, it's medieval law," and smile into the dark. You wake to the sound of church bells and creaking timbers above your head. The morning light filters through cracks in the shutters, slicing golden dust through your tiny room. Your stomach grumbles, and the scent of bread baking down the lane makes it worse. You wander out, following the smell toward the manor hall, only to be stopped by a stern-faced steward holding a ladle like a weapon. "Not yet," he snaps. "The Lord hasn't lifted his spoon." Welcome to medieval dining etiquette, where your hunger waited on hierarchy. Meals in the Middle Ages weren't just about food, they were social choreography. Every movement, from how you washed your hands to when you took your first bite, followed invisible rules of rank. The most important one? Never, ever start eating before your superior. That simple gesture, waiting, wasn't just respect. It was survival in a world where power could be as fragile as a loaf of day-old bread. At the high table sat your lord, maybe his family, and perhaps a favored guest. Everyone else, servants, soldiers, scullions, waited along the lower benches, staring at steaming trenchers of bread piled with meat juice and vegetables, pretending not to drool. The moment the Lord picked up his spoon or tore the first piece of bread, it was like a silent command. Only then could everyone else begin. To break that rule was more than rude. It was rebellious. In the wrong setting, it could mark you as arrogant, or worse, as someone who didn't know their place. And in a society obsessed with divine order, that was dangerous business. Because, see, medieval people believed hierarchy came from God himself. The king ruled by divine right, the lord by royal favor, and the peasant, well, by mud and mercy. Meals mirrored heaven's order, God at the head, angels next, mortals far below. Eating before your superior was like biting before the Almighty. But it wasn't all grim obedience. There was an artistry to these meals. Each course arrived with pageantry. Roasted pheasants dressed in their own feathers, pies shaped like castles, soups poured from pitchers carved with saints. In grand halls, minstrels played soft lute music, while servants in liveried tunics carried platters down long oak tables. The smell of roasted boar, mixed with candle smoke and wine, thick enough to make you dizzy. Still, even in that splendor, rules ruled everything. You didn't wipe your mouth with your sleeve. You didn't lick your knife. You didn't complain about salt. One handbook for young knights warned, better to starve in silence than offend your host with haste. Imagine your dinner table today with that rule. Half the room would go hungry before dessert. Here's a quirky tidbit: forks were scandalous when they first appeared in Europe. They arrived from Byzantium around the 11th century, and people thought they were sinful. Churchmen said using a fork was mocking God's design, since he gave us fingers for eating. The first woman known to use one regularly, a Venetian noblewoman, was called vain and ungrateful. After she died young, preachers claimed it was divine punishment for her fancy cutlery. So, yeah. Next time you twirl spaghetti, you're committing medieval blasphemy. The meal order itself was sacred ritual. The first course usually honored the church calendar. Fish on Fridays, pottage a thick stew on fasting days, roasted meat when celebrations allowed, Peasants rarely saw meat at all. Their daily bread was dark, coarse, and dense with barley or oats. Meanwhile, the Lord's loaf was fine white wheat, literally called manchet bread, a sign of purity and status. Even bread had a class system. And speaking of bread, here's something fascinating. Your plate was bread. People ate from trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up juices and grease. When you finished, the trencher was either eaten zealous, if you were poured, or given to servants or beggars, if you were nobled. So generosity, in a way, came baked right into the furniture. Historians still argue whether this system was practical or pure performance. Was the dining order really about hygiene, keeping nobles from catching peasant germs? Or was it just another show of control? Maybe both. After all, the medieval mind saw the world in layers, heaven above, hell below, and everything in between ranked by birth and behavior. Dinner was just another stage for that cosmic drama. Imagine sitting there, the Lord laughing at some bawdy tale while you wait, spoon trembling in your hand, stomach howling. The fire crackles, dogs bark beneath the tables, and the smell of roasted goose fills the hall. Finally, he raises his spoon. That tiny gesture feels like sunlight breaking through clouds. You eat, fast, quietly, gratefully. Even outside manners, meal order mattered. In monasteries, monks ate in strict silence, each waiting for a bell to signal the start. In towns, guild members dined according to rank, masters first, apprentices last. Even families followed age-based order. The father began, the mother next, then children by birth order. It sounds suffocating, but it kept peace in large, tense households where one wrong move could cause scandal, or a fight with knives not meant for eating. There was also spiritual meaning behind timing. Before each meal, bread was blessed, hands washed in communal basins, and sometimes even prayers recited between bites. You didn't just eat to fill your belly, you ate to honor divine providence. To interrupt that sequence was like rewriting scripture. And yet, contradictions flourished. While peasants starved, nobles threw food theatrically, literally. Banquet games involved flinging pies, hiding live birds inside pastries, or staging mock battles between sugar castles. One chronicler describes a feast where knights jested across the table with skewers. Imagine your dinner turning into a medieval food fight, all while servants stood stone-faced, forbidden to taste a crumb. Still, the rule of no eating before your lord wasn't all cruelty. It ensured discipline, reinforced gratitude, and, in a strange way, built community. Everyone waited together. Everyone began together. That moment of stillness before the first bite carried a kind of shared reverence. A reminder that food, scarce and sacred, came from beyond human control. Picture the scene late at night after a long harvest day. A peasant family sits around a wooden table, a single candle guttering between them. They wait for the eldest to cross himself and take a piece of bread. Only then do they eat. It's not fear, it's ritual. It's how they say thank you in a world where every loaf is hard-earned. Of course, the wealthy had their loopholes. Lords could begin a meal and then wander off to talk politics, leaving others awkwardly halfway through their pottage. Servants might sneak bites in the kitchen, breaking rules quietly, chewing fast in the smoky dark. People always find ways around power. And yes, the church occasionally stepped in. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, after all. Priests preached moderation, urging diners to eat as Christ ate, slowly, soberly, and with eyes toward heaven. But they weren't exactly consistent. Some abbots were legendary for their feasts, with barrels of wine and 20-course meals, in the name of hospitality. By the late Middle Ages, dining rules had softened. The Renaissance brought manners books, like Erasmus's On Civility in Children, that taught young nobles how to behave without turning supper into a sermon. But even then, the echoes of those early restrictions lingered. Wait your turn, your mother might say today, and somewhere deep in that phrase is the ghost of a medieval steward guarding the Lord's spoon. It's funny, isn't it? In a way, that rule still lives on every time you pause before a toast, or let a guest take the first bite at dinner. The idea that food connects us, and that respect begins with patience. It's ancient. So next time you sit down hungry and someone says, "Wait," imagine yourself back in a stone hall, torchlight flickering on carved beams, your belly rumbling, eyes on the head of the table. You're not just waiting. You're part of an unbroken chain of etiquette stretching across centuries. And when that first spoon lifts, you'll understand the quiet power of that strange old rule. The fire has burned low, painting long shadows across the timbered walls. Outside, the village exhales into darkness. Chickens are silent, dogs curl by the door, and the last embers of daylight fade behind the church steeple. You reach for a candle, just a small one, and hear your neighbor hiss, "Don't light that! Not after curfew!" It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But in the Middle Ages, that single flicker of flame could mean fines, suspicion, or worse. Tonight, you learn the rule of the forbidden night candles. See, medieval nights weren't just dark. They were alive with danger. Without streetlights or glass windows, the world beyond your door turned into a black ocean. Fire was both friend and monster. It gave warmth and safety, but one gust of wind, one drunken stumble, and an entire street could vanish in flames. Towns built of thatch and timber burned like kindling, and open flames were everywhere. Candles, hearths, lanterns, even torches used as hand lamps. So, city councils across Europe passed rules: no fires after dark, unless you were nobility or clergy. Extinguish your light by curfew bell. The town criers would shout before dusk, "Bank your hearths! Quench your tapers!" The message was clear: the night belonged to quiet, not flame. You picture yourself in a small English village around 1300. A church bell tolls slowly, 9 heavy chimes that echo through narrow lanes. That was the curfew bell. From the old French cover, feu, meaning cover the fire. You'd rush to scatter ash over your hearth and pinch your candle's wick, the smell of smoke curling through the room. Once that bell stopped ringing, firelight was outlawed. But not just for safety. Night was considered a dangerous, even sinful time. The devil's hour, monks called it. People believed spirits, thieves, and temptation all thrived after dark. So, limiting candle use wasn't only about stopping fires. It was about stopping you. Candles were expensive too. A single beeswax candle could cost a day's wages, so most peasants relied on smoky tallow ones made from animal fat. They stank like old stew and left greasy soot on walls. So when the bell rang, you weren't just obeying law, you were conserving precious resources. And of course, where there's prohibition, there's mischief. Some townsfolk defied the rule, whispering tales and gossip in flickering light. Others used darkness as cover for forbidden love or secret meetings. That's why constables patrolled the streets after curfew, sniffing for smoke and listening for laughter. In London, a 14th century ordinance stated that No man shall wander the streets with candle or torch after the bell, upon pain of prison. Imagine being locked up for bedtime reading. In monasteries, things were stricter still. Monks rose at midnight for prayer, but even they weren't allowed to carry lights outside the chapel. God sees without flame, one abbot reminded them. In nunneries, candles after compline, the last prayer of the day, were outright forbidden. Too much temptation, apparently. You can fill in the rest. Yet the rule wasn't all gloom. There was poetry in medieval darkness. Without artificial light, people lived by moon and stars. Farmers timed planting by lunar cycles. Sailors read constellations as maps. Lovers met in secret gardens, guided by starlight and memory. And for the poor, darkness meant peace from toil. When you couldn't see your hands, you stopped working. Still, the fear of night ran deep. One chronicler described how villagers huddled together, whispering prayers when the wind blew. They swore ghosts roamed crossroads, and witches gathered by candlelight to curse crops. Even the owl's hoot sent shivers down spines. It was called the bird of death. You'd think all this fear would fade with time, but superstition has a long shelf life. During the 13th century, some towns introduced night watches. Volunteers who patrolled with lanterns, making sure no illicit lights burned. Ironically, they were the only ones allowed to carry torches after dark. Firefighters and fire starters rolled into one. There's one quirky tidbit from medieval France in Paris. Households were ordered to hang lanterns outside their doors on certain feast days to honor God and protect travelers. Anyone who failed could be fined. So yes, street lighting began not for safety, but for piety. Historians still argue whether these fire rules were more about control than caution. Sure, they prevented blazes, but they also forced people indoors, curbing crime, and conveniently rebellion. After all, it's hard to plan a revolt when you can't see your conspirators. Picture the scene again. The curfew bell tolls, echoing over thatched roofs. The tavern keeper snuffs his lamps, the last drinkers shuffle home, and a deep hush falls over the village. The only glow comes from the church window, where a priest's candle burns with divine permission. Everywhere else, just silence, darkness, and the rhythmic creak of shutters. You crawl beneath your blanket, feeling the night press close. The moonlight pools through cracks in the wood, silvering the floorboards. You hear a whisper outside. A fox. A thief. Maybe something older. Older than words. You'd like a candle right now, wouldn't you? Just a small one. But you remember the law, the fines, the whispers of spirits drawn to light. You close your eyes instead. And here's the funny part in many towns. People eventually missed their night fires so much that they invented safe loopholes. Stone hearth covers called curfew caps allowed embers to smoulder unseen until morning. You could obey the law while still waking to warm coals. That's where the word curfew we still use today comes from. A centuries-old bedtime ritual turned modern vocabulary. By the 15th century, with better chimneys and more stone buildings, the rules relaxed. People lit candles again, even read or stitched clothes by them. But the habit of quiet, of keeping to one's hearth, lingered. Night remained sacred, not for fear, but for rest. If you've ever felt that strange calm when the lights go out, that small thrill of safety in darkness, you've touched something medieval. You've honored a rule born of flame and fear, still echoing softly through your nightly routines. So, next time your power goes out, or you blow out the last candle before bed, pause. Listen to the silence hum around you. Somewhere in that darkness, you might almost hear a bell tolling through the centuries. Kuva, few. Cover your fire, sleep safe. Because sometimes, the weirdest rules, the ones that made no sense in daylight, were exactly what kept the night from swallowing the world whole. The morning mist clings to your clothes as you wander through a bustling medieval market square. Everywhere you look, color and texture tell silent stories. Woven laws stitched into every thread. A merchant in rich crimson velvet strides past, his sleeves dragging almost to the ground. Beside him, a tanner's wife in dull grey wool clutches her basket tight, careful not to meet his gaze. You glance down at your own plain tunic and wonder, what would happen if you wore that red? You'd be in trouble. Because in the Middle Ages, what you wore wasn't just fashion, it was law. These were called sumptuary laws, and they existed across Europe for centuries. They dictated what fabrics, colors, jewelry, and even shoe lengths people could wear, not because anyone cared about matching, but because clothing reflected status, and God's divine order supposedly depended on everyone dressing properly. The rule was simple. Nobles dressed like nobles, merchants dressed like merchants, peasants dressed like, well, survivors. It sounds absurd now, but in a society obsessed with hierarchy, clothes weren't personal expression. They were public obedience. If your sleeve was too long, your fur too fine, or your color too bold, you weren't just committing a fashion fox pass. You were breaking the law. Imagine it. You've worked hard, saved coins for months, and finally buy a scrap of imported silk from an Italian trader. You stitch it into a trim for your collar, feeling a little fancy. The next week, the bailiff spots it during Mass, frowns, and slaps you with a fine equal to a month's wages. All for looking slightly too successful. Why such fuss over fabric? Because in the medieval mindset, appearance equaled morality. Nobles believed that wealth was proof of divine favor. If peasants began dressing richly, it threatened the entire cosmic order. God above, king below, peasants at the bottom. If everyone started blending together in silk and fur, how could the world stay balanced? 14th century English law literally declared that no man of yeoman or lower degree shall wear cloth of gold, silk, or silver. Even shoe points were regulated. Your social rank determined how long the tips of your shoes could be. The noblest wore absurdly long polainas that curled like fishhooks, while commoners had to settle for blunt toes. Imagine a world where your shoelace could reveal your salary. Here's a fun bit: laws about fur were especially strict. Only nobles could wear ermine or sable. Merchants might get away with fox or rabbit, but peasants, they were stuck with sheepskin. If they could afford that much, the irony. Monks, sworn to poverty, often wore the finest wool cloaks because that kept them humble through comfort. Go figure. Historians still argue whether these rules actually worked. Many people ignored them, especially rising middle classes who'd made money through trade. In cities like Florence or London, wealthy merchants wore silks under plain cloaks, revealing their riches only behind closed doors. Human nature has always loved loopholes. In England, the statutes of apparel under Queen Elizabeth is a later echo of medieval law, listed clothing privileges by rank in excruciating detail. Dukes could wear cloth of gold. Knights could wear velvet trimmed with silver, servants plain wool. Even children's outfits were controlled. A tailor could be punished for embroidering beyond his station. But let's go back earlier, to the heart of the medieval mindset. These rules weren't just about ego, they were about economics. Imported dyes like Tyrian purple and indigo came from faraway lands. So authorities wanted to protect domestic markets by limiting who could buy them. Only nobles could afford certain colors, keeping trade profits flowing through elite hands. And oh, the symbolism! Every hue had meaning. Purple meant royalty and piety. Red signified power, and sometimes sin. Green was the color of youth and love, often worn by brides, or ironically, by outlaws like Robin Hood. Black was for the serious, the learned, or the very rich, since true black dye was expensive to make. You might chuckle, but color could change your fate. A butcher caught wearing scarlet might be accused of pretending to nobility, fined, whipped, or publicly humiliated. One French edict even ordered tailors to burn illegal garments on the wearer's doorstep. Imagine the shame of watching your new doublet go up in smoke while the whole village laughed. Yet, there was a softer side to this rigidity. These laws also offered a sense of identity. People could glance at a crowd and instantly know everyone's place. Who to bow to, who to trust, who to avoid. It kept society predictable in a time when chaos, war, plague, famine was always nearby. And don't forget, the church had its own wardrobe rules. Priests wore specific vestments, each symbolizing virtue: white for purity, red for martyrdom, green for life. Even peasants knew what feast day. It was just by glancing at a priest's robes. Fashion as calendar. Then there were wedding laws. Brides couldn't wear certain fabrics unless their family ranked high enough. In Italy, some towns forbade gold, thread embroidery on bridal gowns for modesty's sake. Meanwhile, in England, laws said only noble brides could wear jewels upon the hair or brow. The rest had to settle for ribbons or flowers if they were lucky. You, walking through this world, would feel the weight of your wardrobe. Every thread told a story of who you were allowed to be. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Women, for instance, faced extra restrictions. A widow might be forced to wear black for years, and if she dared wear color too soon, tongues would wag that she was hungry for remarriage. Men had it easier, but even they couldn't wear certain hat shapes reserved for knights or clerics. And still, rebellion stitched itself into the seams. The young especially loved to push limits. Bright hose, oversized sleeves, flashy belts. The sin of vanity, priests warned, shaking their heads. But fashion is stubborn. When the church banned flashy jewelry, people began decorating their belts instead. When gold thread was outlawed, they used brass. If one fabric was forbidden, they mixed two to create something new. Medieval fashion policing was basically a centuries-long game of whack-a-mole. Some historians even see these laws as early PR, rulers using wardrobe control to reinforce their image. Kings and queens set trends intentionally. When Edward III of England banned foreigners' styles, he promoted English cloth instead, boosting local pride. "We're English, buy English," he might as well have said. Sound familiar? You can almost hear the market chatter. That shade of blue. Careful. Only barons can wear that. Your sleeves look too rich. Best cut them shorter before someone reports you. And through it all, tailors thrived, living dangerously on the edge of legality, quietly sewing forbidden glamour for clients who could pay for secrecy. In truth, these weird clothing rules were never just about vanity or control. They were about safety too. Social, moral, and even financial. If you looked richer than you were, you could attract thieves, taxes, or suspicion. Blending in meant survival. So while the rules sound absurd to modern ears, in a way, they were a kind of medieval armor. By the end of the 15th century, as trade exploded and printing spread ideas faster than any law could contain, fashion began to democratize. Middle-class merchants wore velvet openly, and peasants started adding colorful trims. The world was changing, and the seams of society were stretching. Still, whenever you slip on your favorite jacket, or put on something out of your budget, remember, you're committing a tiny act of rebellion that once could have cost a fortune, or worse. And as the candlelight flickers in your medieval chamber, casting soft shadows across your humble wool tunic, you can smile knowing that somewhere, centuries ago, someone was fined for looking as good as you do right now. The world beyond your village smells of smoke, sweat, and iron. You've stepped onto the road that binds every medieval life together. The long, winding arteries of trade and travel. Dust clings to your boots as you follow the caravan lines, where merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and thieves all share the same rutted paths. This isn't a journey of comfort. It's a slow crawl through a dangerous, breathtaking network of human ambition. In the Middle Ages, roads were less like highways and more like scars across the land, muddy, uneven, and often flooded. A journey of 20 miles could take 2 days if the weather turned foul. But travel was everything. Without it, kingdoms stagnated, towns starved, and faith never spread. Every step you take along this medieval road connects to the heartbeat of a civilization in motion. You pass the pilgrims first. Clad in coarse robes, they shuffle toward distant holy sites. Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury. They carry scallop shells, walking staffs, and tales of miracles. Pilgrimage wasn't just travel. It was penance, adventure, and social opportunity all in one. For some, it was a ticket to redemption. For others, an excuse to escape dull village life. Many never made it home. Next come the merchants, the lifeblood of medieval trade. Their wagons creak under the weight of spices, salt, cloth, and glass. From the east, caravans bring silks, pepper, and cinnamon, treasures worth their weight in silver. From the north, ships unload furs and fish. The smell of the market lingers even on the open road. Ambergris honey, leather, and sweat mingling into something strangely alive. If you stop at a roadside inn, you'll find a mix of people. A wary priest mumbling prayers over his bread, a minstrel tuning his lute, a mercenary sharpening his sword, and a merchant nervously watching his coin purse. Inns were the great equalizers of travel, places where saints and sinners ate from the same bowl. The ull was often weak, the beds infested, but the gossip was priceless, and danger was never far. Bandits lurked along forest paths and river crossings, preying on anyone who carried coin. The roads between towns like London and York were notorious for ambushes. Even nobles travelled with armed guards, and priests prayed over their journeys. One wrong turn, one broken wheel, and you might not make it to the next town at all. The medieval church, for all its piety, thrived on movement. Monks travelled between abbeys to deliver manuscripts or relics. Pilgrims filled cathedrals with offerings, fueling local economies. Roads became veins of faith, each mile another chance for redemption, trade, or storytelling. And then there were the gypsies, the wanderers, often mistrusted, sometimes celebrated. They arrived with strange instruments, dances, and foreign tongues. Locals whispered that they were sorcerers or thieves, but their music carried something wild, untamed. a rhythm the fixed world couldn't silence. Along these same roads moved armies, armored columns of knights and foot soldiers, banners snapping in the wind. When war came, travel turned deadly. Roads filled with smoke, bodies, and broken carts. The same path that once carried silk and pilgrims now carried death. But even war couldn't stop the movement. It only changed its direction. In towns, bridges became centers of life. Many were lined with tiny chapels or even shops. Crossing one wasn't just a physical act. It was a passage between worlds, the rural and the urban, the sacred and the profane. Beneath them, rivers carried boats loaded with grain, wool, and dreams. For the common traveler, though, life on the road meant hardship. Food spoiled quickly, shoes wore thin, and inns charged too much. Some carried charms, iron crosses, relics, or bits of bone, to ward off spirits said to haunt the woods. In a world still half in shadow, every journey had a touch of superstition. The lucky few who made their way to great cities like Venice, Bruges, or Paris found marvels beyond imagining. Venetian docks swarmed with languages from every shore. Bruges gleamed with dyed cloth and jewels. Paris smelled of bread, tallow, and ambition. For a peasant who'd never seen more than his village, it was like walking into heaven, or hell, depending on the pickpockets. And then came the fairs, the true heartbeat of medieval commerce. Once a year, great gatherings like the Champagne Fairs in France drew traders from across Europe. Picture it: rows of tents bursting with fabrics, spices, relics, and livestock. Minstrels sang, jesters juggled, lovers slipped away behind stalls, and merchants haggled until dawn. These fairs weren't just markets, they were living theatres of human exchange. For many, travel was a rare privilege. Most peasants never strayed more than a few miles from home. But for those who did, pilgrims, traders, mercenaries, the road was freedom. It stripped away the boundaries of class and custom, at least for a while. On the road, everyone was simply a traveller. As night falls, you stop beneath a crooked oak. The stars above are the same ones sailors follow, the same ones priests bless and lovers wish upon. You wrap your cloak tighter, listen to the wind hum through the leaves, and realize this road isn't just dirt. It's the story of human movement, every footprint, a fragment of history pressed into the soil. By morning, you'll move again. Maybe toward a city, maybe toward a shrine, maybe nowhere at all. But you'll walk, because that's what medieval life demanded. Motion. Persistence. Faith. In the Middle Ages, survival wasn't about where you lived. It was about how far you dared to go. You wake to the low murmur of bells echoing across damp fields. Dawn mist curls over the rooftops, and the scent of wood smoke mixes with wet earth. Today isn't just another day of toil. It's a holy day. One of those times when the entire rhythm of medieval life slows down, whether you want it to or not. The rule is clear: no work on holy days. That doesn't just mean Sundays. It could mean dozens of feast days scattered through the calendar. Saint days, Marian festivals, Eastertide, Christmas, even local patron feasts. For a farmer, that could add up to nearly 1/3 of the year where you were forbidden to labor. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, not quite. Because in a world where your harvest decides if your family eats or starves, resting because the priest said so can feel like a gamble with God. Still, the rule stands. Break the Sabbath, and you risk your soul. You shoulder your hoe and glance toward the church tower. The bells toll again, slower this time, like the voice of heaven reminding you to behave. Even the oxen seem to know it's not a day for the fields. So, instead of ploughing, you shuffle toward the village green, where everyone gathers for Mass. The church doors yaw open, spilling candlelight onto muddy boots. Inside, it smells of wax, stone, and incense. A heavy perfume of devotion and discipline. You kneel beside neighbors you've argued with all week, all of you pretending not to notice. The priest climbs the pulpit, his voice echoing through the nave. He reminds everyone that the Lord rested on the seventh day, and so must you. To work on a Sunday, he says, is to mock creation itself. Somewhere near the back, a baker sighs. He was hoping to fire his oven before the dough spoiled. In medieval logic, holy rest wasn't just about faith. It was about cosmic balance. The world had an ordered day and night, sowing and reaping, work and stillness. To disturb that rhythm was to invite chaos. Of course, not everyone obeyed. Historians still argue whether the Church's enforcement of rest days was truly spiritual or simply social control. Either way, disobedience had consequences. Local officials, sometimes called Sunday wardens, patrolled markets and fields. If they caught you baking bread, selling fish, or even hanging laundry, you could be fined, shamed, or forced to confess publicly. In some towns, Sunday idlers were paradoxically punished for not resting properly, for skipping Mass, or turning the Sabbath into drunken mischief. You couldn't win. Rest too little, and you offended God. Rest too much, and you offended the priest. After the sermon, the congregation spills out into the sunlight. The rest of the day unfolds slowly, lazily. Children chase geese. Women gossip while spinning wool. Men linger near the alehouse doorway pretending not to drink. Bells mark the hours, dividing time into prayer and leisure. The air feels different, softer, slower, somehow blessed. But not everyone has the luxury to relax. Down by the river, a miller secretly turns his wheel, hoping the splash of water hides the sound. He's behind on his grain quota, and saints' days don't feed his children. If he's caught, he could lose more than a day's work. He could lose his millstone. You pass a blacksmith's forge, shuttered and cold. His hammer rests beside an unfinished horseshoe. For a man who measures his life in sparks and rhythm, silence feels wrong. His arms ache to swing, but superstition grips harder. They say striking iron on the Lord's day invites lightning. In towns, the Sabbath brings an eerie quiet. No merchants shouting prices, no carts clattering over cobbles. Just the sound of bells, crows, and the occasional lute drifting from a tavern. Inns stay open, of course. The church may preach rest, but even monks light their awl after Mass. There's a kind of gentle hypocrisy woven into it all. Lords and priests scold peasants for working, yet their own servants cook their meals and polish their boots without pause. You notice it but say nothing. The rules bend differently for those born closer to heaven. Still, there's beauty in these pauses. As afternoon warms the stone walls, you watch families gather beneath trees, sharing bread, cheese, and laughter. For one day, there's no sowing, no scything, no shouting over debts, just quiet conversations and the hum of bees. By evening, the shadows stretch long across the village. You hear a fiddle tune from the owl house, a soft, lilting melody that feels half prayer, half rebellion. Inside, mugs clink, and someone jokes about the priest's sermon. You smile into your drink, because you know tomorrow the fields will call again, and this moment of peace will vanish like mist. The rule about resting on holy days might sound rigid, but it served a deeper purpose. In an age of exhaustion, it was a rare mercy. Rest wasn't laziness. It was obedience, health, even survival. Without it, people would simply work themselves into the ground. Scholars debate whether medieval folk truly saw rest as sacred or simply as an enforced break from endless labor. Either way, it stitched rhythm into their lives. Seasons turned, bells rang, and humans learned to breathe between harvests. Some evenings, as twilight settled, people believed the veil between worlds grew thin. On those still nights, stories flowed of saints, miracles, and spectral visitors who punished Sabbath breakers. You remember an old tale the innkeeper told. A farmer who ploughed on a Sunday and found his oxen turned to stone. You still walk past that rock formation sometimes and wonder. Now, as stars prick the sky, you sit outside the cottage, staring at the moon glinting on the thatch. The silence feels holy in itself, a kind of peace that doesn't need priests to bless it. Somewhere far off, a nightingale sings, and for once, the world feels exactly balanced. Tomorrow, you'll rise before dawn again. You'll shoulder your tools and return to the rhythm of work. But for now, you rest. Not just because you're told to, but because something inside you knows that even the earth needs time to breathe. And that's the quiet brilliance of these strange medieval rules. Beneath the fear, the superstition, and the sermons, there's a whisper of wisdom. Stop moving, or you'll forget what it means to live. The Sabbath isn't a command anymore. It's a sigh, a pause, a reminder that time, like the soul, needs tending too. The wind carries a low clang across the sleeping town. 1, 2, 3, soft, deliberate strikes from the bell tower. You pause mid-step, lantern trembling in your hand. The curfew bell has spoken. Its sound isn't just an announcement. It's a warning, a border between safety and peril. By decree of the town council, no one should be in the streets after curfew. Not merchants, not lovers, not even the cats if they could read the law. The gates will soon be locked, and the world outside, bandits, wolves, and worse, will belong to the dark. You pull your cloak tighter as you hurry toward the gatehouse. The guards are already swinging the heavy oak doors inward. Iron bolts slide into place with a final thud that seems to echo through your bones. You're trapped inside now, just like everyone else. It sounds oppressive, but these rules existed for good reasons. Fires, for one thing. Medieval towns were tinderboxes of thatch and timber. One spark from a candle or hearth could erase an entire street. The curfew, derived from the old French cove, feu, cover the fire, was a literal command: smother your flames, bank your embers, and go to bed before the night devours you. You glance at the glowing windows fading one by one, like stars being blown out. It's strangely beautiful, this orchestrated darkness. The silence deepens until you can hear only the wind rustling banners and the soft splash of the moat. Inside the walls, the streets turn eerie. The scent of tallow and smoke lingers. Cats slip through alleys, hunting rats by moonlight. The night watch begins its rounds. Slow, echoing footsteps on cobblestones, accompanied by the occasional rattle of a pike. They call out the hours in sing-song voices. 10:00, the clock, and all's well. Their duty is simple: keep peace, catch thieves, and ensure no one defies the curfew. But human curiosity is stronger than law. You see a silhouette at a shutter, someone whispering to a lover outside, risking the constable's wrath for one more glance. The night watchmen were often a motley crew. Old soldiers, apprentices, or men forced into duty instead of paying fines. They carried lanterns, staves, and sometimes dogs. If they caught you wandering without reason, you'd be hauled before the bailiff by sunrise. Unless, of course, you had a good excuse, midwife's call, sickness, or church work. Even then, suspicion clung like smoke. But the fear wasn't just about crime or fire. It was also about superstition. People believed darkness belonged to spirits. Witches were said to dance in crossroads, demons to lurk near churchyards. The curfew bell was a kind of exorcism, a public prayer disguised as policy. When it rang, it reminded everyone that humans had no business roaming under moonlight. Historians still argue whether curfew enforcement was more practical or spiritual. Records show councils fining bakers for lighting ovens too late. Yet, at the same time, priests blessed the bell ropes to keep evil at bay. The truth, like most medieval things, sits somewhere between piety and paranoia. You keep walking through the hush, guided only by the faint glow of your lantern. Each house you pass has its own tale. A blacksmith's forge cooling to silence, a widow's candle extinguished with a whispered prayer, a tavern door barred tight, but leaking laughter from within. Sometimes, though, the night hides rebellion. Beneath curfew's shadow, smugglers move quietly through the alleys, carrying contraband salt or ale. Lovers steal to the meadows beyond the wall. Poets and thieves share benches by the river, trading verses and stolen coins. Rules may be firm, but desire has always been clever. You pause by a watchtower, listening to guards mutter over dice. They joke to stay awake, their laughter thin in the cold. One tells a story of seeing the White Lady by the mill stream, a ghost doomed to wander because she defied curfew centuries ago. Everyone laughs, too loudly, but their eyes flick to the dark water anyway. The streets weren't the only things the bell sealed. City gates closed at the same time, locking out travelers who arrived too late. Imagine trudging through rain and finding the gate barred. Torches flickering above, voices calling down. Come back at dawn? If you were lucky, you might find shelter in a church porch. If not, you'd curl up beneath hedges, praying the wolves were already fed. And yet, curfew created a strange kind of comfort. Inside the walls, life followed rhythm. Bells for dawn, bells for prayer, bells for sleep. People trusted the sound. It meant order in a chaotic world. When the last toll faded, you could breathe easier, knowing everyone was home. Every hearth dark, every sin postponed until morning. From your window, the moonlight paints the empty street silver. Somewhere, a shutter creaks, a dog barks once, then silence again. The night feels endless and fragile at once. You realize that curfew isn't just control, it's community. It binds hundreds of people in shared vulnerability, everyone trusting everyone else to obey. Still, temptation hums. You remember tales of students in Oxford who sneaked out after bells, racing to taverns before the watch found them. One famous brawl in 1355 ended with several deaths, and the entire university excommunicated. Even rules meant for safety could spark chaos when youth and ale collided. You can't help but smile at the absurdity of it. A rule made to keep peace accidentally creating more trouble. The medieval world excelled at that sort of irony. Now the night deepens. Clouds drift across the moon, shadows lengthen, and the bell tower looms like a century of time itself. Somewhere far beyond, in another village, another bell rings. The sound rolls across fields and forests, joining others until the whole landscape hums with invisible discipline. You set your lantern by the window, its light small but stubborn. You imagine the watchmen making their rounds, calling the hours, stamping their feet against the cold. They keep the rhythm, you keep the peace, and between you both, the world stays intact for one more night. Tomorrow, the gates will open again, and sunlight will spill across the cobbles. Markets will buzz, children will shout, and the memory of darkness will fade until the bell calls again. For now, you pull your blanket tighter, listening to that faint metallic echo lingering in your mind. A reminder that even in the Middle Ages, survival was a matter of listening when the world told you to rest. Because sometimes, safety isn't freedom. It's the sound of the curfew bell telling you it's okay to sleep. Morning light trickles through the shutters, and somewhere the smell of roasting fish drifts through the air. But today, that aroma is forbidden. It's Friday, a fasting day. One of the strangest and most strictly enforced rules of medieval life. And if you're caught eating the wrong thing, you might as well confess before your stomach finishes swallowing. You sigh and look down at your plate, a grey bowl of pottage, thick with barley and a few wilted greens. Not exactly a feast, but this rule, no meat on certain days, isn't just about self-denial. It's about balance, economy, and even survival. In the medieval world, faith and food were inseparable. The church dictated what could touch your tongue on which day. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Lent were off limits to flesh. Advent, too. That meant nearly half the calendar year was a vegetarian test of virtue. The official reason: to purify the soul and honor Christ's sacrifice. The practical reason: to manage livestock and stretch food supplies. You can almost hear the priest's sermon echoing in your memory. Abstain from meat, brothers and sisters, lest gluttony devour your soul. You nod politely, even as your stomach growls loud enough to startle a nearby chicken. The rule wasn't universal, though. Historians still argue whether everyone obeyed, or whether these restrictions were mostly symbolic. In practice, rich nobles often found creative loopholes. Because, as it turns out, loopholes taste delicious. Take beaver tails, for instance. Church scholars once ruled that since beavers spent most of their lives in water, their tails counted as fish. Monks rejoiced. Dinners suddenly included roasted beaver tail, served with herbs and butter. And if that seems absurd, wait until you hear that barnacle geese were also declared fish because people believed they hatched from driftwood that floated in from the sea. Problem solved. Seafood with feathers. Meanwhile, peasants made do with what they had: eels, herring, pottage, and bread. Dried fish was the medieval equivalent of fast food, cheap, salty, and available everywhere. During Lent, towns reeked of brine and oil, an entire society smelling faintly of old fish and piety. But the rule wasn't purely religious theatre. Fasting seasons kept meat consumption in check, ensuring herds could replenish and crops could stretch through the year. It was an early form of sustainability, centuries before anyone used the word. At the monastery down the hill, the bell tolls for dinner. Inside, monks sit in silence, heads bowed over steaming bowls of peas and onions. One of them sneaks a glance at a pot near the hearth, where something richer simmers in secret. Monastic life demanded discipline, but temptation has always loved a loophole. You take a walk through the market. Fishmongers are doing brisk business. Baskets of salted cod, barrels of herring, rows of eels writhing in buckets. They shout blessings at passers-by, half in jest.
"Oh, holy Lent to you, friend! Fresh fish for your sins!"
Further down, a noble's cook haggles over imported spices. Lent or not, her lord will dine well tonight. Somewhere between religion and indulgence lies the heart of medieval hypocrisy. Piety with a pinch of pepper. The church took fasting very seriously. Eating meat on forbidden days could lead to confession, fines, or even public penance. But there was also mercy. Pregnant women travelers, soldiers, and the sick were often excused. It was less about punishment and more about control. A way to keep society in rhythm with sacred time. And yet, fasting became a kind of art form. Kitchens turned inventive. Fish pies baked with saffron and almonds, stews thickened with beer, and mock meats, made from crushed nuts or legumes, filled the gap. Medieval cooks loved illusion dishes, like false venison, made from spiced fish shaped into a roast. The result, holiness with flavor. You remember your grandmother's tale about the local abbot, who fasted so devoutly that he refused even milk. His monks, desperate to keep him alive, fed him pureed eels, calling it holy broth. He never questioned it. Miracles, it seems, often came with a spoon. By sunset, the rule feels almost comforting. Bells ring again, marking another day survived under heaven's watch. The smell of lentils and herbs drifts from cottages. Families gather around the hearth, breaking bread with quiet reverence. There's something beautiful in the restraint. The sense that, just for one evening, you share a discipline that stretches across all of Christendom. You sit beside the fire, nibbling on rye bread, listening to the whisper of rain outside. You think about how strange this rule would sound in the future. An entire continent coordinated by diet, its morality measured in meals. But here, it makes sense. Food is faith. Hunger is humility. And a little deprivation keeps everyone tethered to the same sky. Still, fasting days weren't without rebellion. You've heard whispers of taverns in back alleys serving Friday stew with suspiciously rich flavor, a wink, a coin, and the innkeeper might slide you a bowl that tastes a little too good to be fish. You can't help but laugh quietly. Even the holiest rules, it seems, invite a touch of sin. Maybe that's what keeps the world interesting, the endless dance between virtue and appetite. Outside, the moon rises over quiet fields. Somewhere, a rooster crows too early, confused by the candlelight spilling from a cottage window. You imagine the farmer inside, tearing a secret bite from a leftover joint of pork, glancing nervously toward the church tower. In the morning, he'll confess, promise to do better, and maybe skip lunch in penance. The rhythm will continue. Feast, fast, confess, repeat. And through it all, the rule endures, shaping not just diets, but identities. The medieval world believed that every choice of food echoed in eternity. You chew slowly, savoring the idea. Maybe, just maybe, these rules weren't about control at all, but about remembering that discipline feeds the spirit as much as food feeds the body. And so, on this quiet night of empty plates and full hearts, you finally understand hunger isn't always punishment. Sometimes, it's prayer. The fire in the hearth crackles low as evening deepens, shadows stretching across the timber walls of the hall. Tonight, you'll witness one of the most mysterious and powerful customs of the medieval world. A practice that bound the living, the dead, and the divine in one fragile thread, the art of prayer and confession. By the glow of candlelight, the priest sits ready, a hood shadowing his face, his ear bent toward the kneeling form of a wary villager. Outside, wind howls through the narrow lanes, carrying whispers of sins unspoken. Inside, it's quiet except for murmurs, the sound of souls unloading centuries of fear, guilt, and faith. Confession wasn't a casual act in the Middle Ages. It was survival. Historians still argue whether the practice was a purely spiritual invention or also a social control mechanism. But for the common people, it felt like the only path to peace. Imagine it, the weight of gossip, theft, lust, hunger, and envy pressing down like the winter sky. Every man and woman, from lords to shepherds, carried something that needed to be released. And the church, ever wise in its understanding of the human heart, turned that need into ritual. The act itself was simple, but profound. Kneel, speak, repent, receive absolution. Yet beneath that simplicity was an entire psychology of redemption. To confess was to expose your darkness, to hand it over to a power greater than yourself, and to emerge lighter, forgiven. But the truth, medieval confession was as much about fear as it was about forgiveness. From childhood, people were taught that every sin, no matter how small, could lead to damnation. The idea of eternal fire wasn't metaphorical. It was visceral, alive in every sermon, painted on every church wall, described in agonizing detail by monks who wanted their flock to tremble. Still, there was beauty in it, the intimacy of trust, the quiet power of being heard. In a world where life was short and unpredictable, the church offered a kind of emotional architecture. Through confession, people could make sense of chaos. Picture a young woman kneeling in the chapel, her fingers trembling around a rosary. She whispers a secret she's never told anyone, a forbidden love, a stolen loaf of bread, a curse muttered in anger. The priest listens, his eyes soft with understanding. "Go in peace, child," he murmurs, "and sin no more." Her tears dry as she steps into the cold night air. The stars above seem brighter. For a moment, the burden is gone. But the system wasn't always so pure. The medieval church often used confession to reinforce obedience. Sins could be forgiven, for a price. The line between penance and payment blurred dangerously, especially as indulgences became widespread. By the 13th century, confessors began assigning not just prayers, but acts of penance, fasting, almsgiving, pilgrimages, even building parts of churches. The message was clear. Salvation had a cost, and it wasn't always spiritual. The confessional became both sanctuary and snare. Lords confessed their cruelty, then returned to war. Merchants confessed their greed, then raised prices. Peasants confessed their despair, then trudged back to endless labor. And yet, week after week, they came back. Because what else could they do? Historians still argue whether confession genuinely changed hearts or simply soothed them long enough to keep society stable. But either way, it worked. It kept the moral rhythm of medieval life steady, like a heartbeat under centuries of faith. In monasteries, confession was even stricter. Monks confessed not just sins but thoughts, pride, distraction, even laughter. Silence followed every admission, thick as incense. The abbot's penance was sometimes gentle, sometimes brutal, a fast, a lash, or a night spent barefoot on cold stone floors, whispering prayers until dawn. Outside the cloister walls, confession took on more theatrical forms. Traveling priests offered field confessions during plagues or wars, hearing dozens of desperate souls at once. Men wept in muddy boots. Women clutched their children, and soldiers begged forgiveness before battle. The air would thrum with whispered prayers, the ground wet with tears and rain. But confession wasn't just about sin. It was about storytelling, about shaping one's life into a narrative of fall and redemption. It turned private shame into shared ritual. It gave the powerless a language for pain, and the powerful a performance of humility. And beneath it all, there was a deep human yearning to be known, to have someone, even a stranger behind a screen, say, "You are not beyond saving." You walk through the church after the last penitent leaves. Candles flicker along the altar, the scent of beeswax and incense lingering in the air. The silence feels sacred, heavy, but comforting. You imagine centuries of confessions soaked into these stones. Secrets that would never be spoken aloud again. At the far end of the nave, a worn wooden chair sits beneath a carved crucifix. You sit for a moment, eyes tracing the face of Christ, the eternal listener. You think of how many times that same image has watched humanity whisper its regrets. In the medieval world, every action carried spiritual weight. To steal was not just theft. It wounded the divine order. To curse was not just anger. It invited demons. And to confess was not just release. It was a realignment with heaven itself. By the time you leave the church, dawn has begun to break. The bells toll softly, summoning the faithful to morning prayer. Farmers cross themselves before heading to the fields. Merchants open their stalls. Children chase chickens through the mud. Life resumes. Forgiven, reset, reborn. And you realize that in a world without therapy, confession was the original form of healing. It bridged the distance between guilt and grace, between chaos and calm. Maybe that's why it still lingers in modern hearts. That ancient desire to speak, to be absolved, to begin again. You close your eyes, whispering a silent thought of your own into the cool morning air. Not quite a sin. Not quite a prayer. Just the quiet human wish to be understood. The sun dips low over the thatched rooftops, painting the sky in a weary gold. You walk through the narrow market streets, the smell of fish and freshly baked bread mingling in the evening air. But tonight, your eyes fall on something curious. A butcher packing away his meat in a hurry, muttering a prayer under his breath. You notice a baker covering his pies, a tavern keeper locking his pantry. And then you remember it's fasting day. In the medieval world, the church didn't just feed your soul. It ruled your stomach. There were rules, long lists of forbidden foods, and enough dietary laws to make a modern nutritionist faint. Some weeks felt like a perpetual Lent, and yet, somehow, people survived, and even thrived, on these strange eating customs. You stroll past a church notice board, its parchment declaring, "No flesh shall pass the lips upon this holy day." The rule sounds simple enough, no meat. But, as always in history, humans found loopholes. Delicious, creative, ridiculous loopholes. For instance, beaver. Yes, the furry, tail-slapping creature of the riverbank. Monks, desperate for protein during meatless days, declared that because beavers lived in water, their tails counted as fish. It sounds absurd, but historians still argue whether the ruling came from genuine theology or hungry monks stretching logic thinner than a fasting wafer. So, in the dim monastery kitchens, the sizzle of beaver tail fat was not a sin. It was supper. The same applied to puffins, barnacle geese, and otters. Anything remotely aquatic could be rebranded as seafood. It was as if the medieval world had its own early version of, if it fits the rules, it's fine. And these weren't just one-off quirks. The church's food laws shaped entire economies. Fishmongers thrived. Rivers were stocked with carp and trout. And inland monasteries built ponds so they could observe the letter of the law while enjoying hearty meals. You can almost hear the monks' laughter, echoing through stone halls as they bit into steaming fish pies, murmuring grace with perfectly straight faces. But not everyone found these rules amusing. For peasants, fasting could be brutal. Meat was already rare, and when it was forbidden, their diets shrank to little more than pottage, a thin vegetable stew, and coarse bread. On cold winter nights, bellies growled beneath wool blankets, while priests preached the virtue of restraint. Still, there was a reason behind it all. Fasting wasn't meant to starve the body, it was supposed to feed the soul. It reminded people of humility, sacrifice, and the fragile balance between survival and sin. The rhythm of feast and fast kept communities spiritually and physically aligned with the seasons. And when feast days finally came, oh, how people celebrated. Tables groaned under roasted meats, jellied eels, cheeses honey-caked, and barrels of ale. For a few glorious hours, hunger turned into joy, and piety into revelry. One can imagine a medieval villager, tipsy from mead, laughing into his sleeve. Fasting's over. God will forgive us tomorrow. But food rules weren't just about holiness. They were about control. The church, with its intricate calendar of restrictions, dictated when and what people could eat, tying every meal to divine authority. It was a subtle, powerful way to govern daily life. Even the rich weren't exempt. Kings and queens might dine from golden plates, but their chefs still tiptoed around ecclesiastical guidelines. During Lent, royal kitchens replaced roasts with elaborate fish dishes sculpted into animal shapes, a feast of faith and creativity. And then came the forbidden indulgences. Those who defied the fasting rules, secretly eating meat, butter, or eggs, risked both earthly punishment and eternal shame. Yet confessions were full of culinary sins. One record even tells of a monk who begged forgiveness for licking bacon, grease off his fingers during Lent. You can't help but grin. That's commitment, if not to faith, then at least to flavor. But why did these laws matter so much? Because, in a world without medicine or modern science, spiritual purity was health. Eating wrongly could corrupt your body and soul alike. The church preached that fasting cleansed the mind, sharpened prayer, and even protected against plague. Of course, historians still argue whether fasting truly improved health or just coincidentally reduced disease through moderation. But one thing is clear, medieval people genuinely believed in its power. And the rules evolved with geography. In coastal towns, people thrived on fish and shellfish, while inland villages developed ingenious substitutes. Almond milk, pea porridge, even mock meats, made from ground grains and herbs. Some of these recipes survive today in the oldest cookbooks of Europe, showing how necessity birthed creativity. You wander into a monastery kitchen, the scent of herbs and oil heavy in the air. A cook stirs a bubbling pot of lentils, humming a hymn. On the table lies a tray of candied roots, parsnips disguised as sweets. Beside them, a pie that looks suspiciously like chicken, but is filled with spiced figs and barley. You realize this isn't just survival, it's culinary theater. Every dish is a dance between obedience and temptation. And outside, ordinary people mirror the same logic. Housewives barter eggs for fish, children sneak crusts of sausage behind barns, and butchers quietly trade special cuts to trusted customers. Even the church turned a blind eye at times. After all, enforcing every rule would have left half of Europe starving. The system thrived on balanced devotion, mixed with indulgence, faith flavored with a dash of human weakness. By candlelight, the fasting calendar reads like poetry. Advent, Lent, Ember Days, Rogation Days, each season marked by abstinence and reflection. These rhythms gave medieval life its heartbeat. To eat or not to eat wasn't just a question of appetite, it was an act of faith. Sometimes, the strangest rules carried the deepest wisdom. Fasting meant restraint in a world that had so little of it. It forced a pause, a breath between harvest and hunger, pleasure and guilt. As you step back into the cool night air, the bells toll again, soft, deliberate, ancient. Somewhere, a family bows their heads over a meal of bread and broth. Somewhere else, a monk whispers a prayer before dipping his spoon. And you can't help but admire the strange, beautiful logic of it all, that in a world obsessed with sin and salvation, even dinner had to follow divine design. You smile, imagining a medieval cook whispering to his stew, "Forgive me, Father, but this needs salt," and maybe, just maybe, heaven smiled back. You step outside the warm glow of the tavern and are instantly met with the sharp, earthy scent of the medieval street. A smell that can only be described as alive. The cobblestones glisten faintly from a recent rain, and rivulets of murky water carry bits of straw, vegetable peelings, and something far less pleasant toward the nearest drain. If you can call a shallow ditch a drain. Welcome to the medieval sanitation system, or rather, the patchwork of weirdly practical, and sometimes downright hilarious rules designed to keep people alive when disease was always lurking just a rat away. Back then, cleanliness didn't mean what it means now. People didn't think of germs. They thought of miasma, or bad air. Illness was believed to float invisibly, carried by foul smells. So, naturally, the best way to stay healthy was to control the stink. That's why cities had a surprising number of laws about where and when you could dump waste. In 14th century London, you could actually be fined for throwing slop out the window without shouting a warning first. Imagine it a woman leaning out with a bucket, yelling, "Garde-lou," before letting fly into the street. Woe to the poor soul walking beneath. And while it sounds chaotic, there was real logic behind it. Those rules prevented accidents, spread of disease, and, perhaps most importantly, preserved civic dignity. Even in the Middle Ages, no one liked stepping in something questionable on the way to church. As you walk along the lane, you notice wooden gutters running beside the houses, carrying wastewater toward the river. Not elegant, but effective. Historians still argue whether these early systems counted as true sanitation, but they certainly kept medieval towns from drowning in their own filth. At least most of the time. In wealthier cities like Paris or Florence, officials known as rakers were hired to clean streets. Their job: shovel dung, sweep refuse, and haul it out beyond the city walls. They were the unsung heroes of hygiene, though few wanted to stand downwind of them. For ordinary people, the main rule was simple: don't foul your neighbor's doorstep. Dumping chamber pots directly outside someone's door was considered not just rude, but sinful. A violation of community harmony. In small villages, offenders might be dragged before the local court and made to clean the streets by hand, a punishment that likely cured them of bad habits fast. And yet, medieval towns were remarkably resilient. During market days, stalls had to follow spacing rules so waste could be swept up more easily. Tanneries and butchers, infamous for their stench, were forced to operate downstream or outside city gates. The logic was all about flow, keep the dirty water moving, and maybe the sickness would move too. You pass a row of stone houses, noticing that each has a narrow alley between it and the next, not for decoration, but for drainage. rainwater, refuse, even the occasional lost chicken, all found their way through those gaps. Inside the homes, people followed smaller but equally strict rituals. Floors were strewn with rushes, reeds, or straw, which absorbed spills and odors. But they weren't replaced as often as you'd hope. Over time, those rushes formed thick, sticky mats of food hair and insects. Royal records even mention a rule requiring castle servants to change rushes at least twice a year. You can almost hear the sigh of relief when someone finally swept them out. Then there were the public latrines. Crude, communal, but astonishingly advanced for their time. Some cities had long benches built over running water channels. Medieval plumbing in action. Monasteries were especially clean. Monks, ever mindful of order, designed stone drain pipes that led waste directly into rivers. Still, not every rule worked as intended. During summer heat, rivers turned foul, and people noticed something unsettling. The worse the smell, the more people got sick. They didn't understand bacteria, but they recognized patterns. So towns began passing ordinances banning butchers from dumping animal remains into waterways. It was one of the earliest forms of environmental regulation, centuries before anyone used the word. And like all things medieval, enforcement depended on who you were. If a nobleman's stable stank, no one dared complain. But if a tanner's shop offended a baron's nose, you could bet fines would rain down like manure in March. You turn a corner into a quieter lane, where a baker's apprentice empties his wash basin into a gutter. He nods politely, wipes his hands on his apron, and goes back to kneading dough. The rhythm of life continues. Work, waste, wash, repeat. Even the church had its say in cleanliness. On holy feast days, streets were scrubbed, wells cleaned, and public fountains blessed. Priests sprinkled holy water over wells, believed to be contaminated by evil spirits. The spiritual met the sanitary in a way only the medieval world could manage. And there was method in the superstition. Blessing wells often coincided with cleaning them, which meant fewer infections. Faith, in its roundabout way, saved lives. In some regions, local councils appointed officials called scavengers, not in the modern sense, but inspectors who ensured no one dumped waste improperly. Their job was less glamorous than a knight's, but arguably more vital to civilization. You pause beside a stone bridge, watching the water flow sluggishly beneath. A few boys toss pebbles into the river, laughing. For all its foulness, that same river is also where people bathe, wash clothes, and sometimes even draw drinking water. It's hard not to marvel at the paradox, that life and death both trickle through the same current. Later, as dusk falls, the night watchman lights his lantern and begins his rounds. He calls out in a rhythmic voice, reminding citizens to keep their fires covered and throw no filth from windows after curfew. Even in darkness, order must prevail. By the 15th century, cities had become so crowded that new laws were passed banning the keeping of pigs inside walls. Too many pigs rooting in the streets meant toppled carts and trampled children. Not exactly godly living. But pigs were valuable waste, eaters, so peasants protested. The compromise. Pigs could stay if they wore bells, so people could dodge them. Yes, you heard right. Bell. Wearing pigs were once a civic solution. And perhaps that's the charm of medieval life. For every absurd rule, there was a grain of reason hidden beneath. So, when someone today complains about modern regulations, imagine explaining to them that once upon a time, you could be arrested for not cleaning up your pig, The night breeze cools the air. You take one last deep breath, careful not to inhale too deeply, and smile. Despite the muck and madness, these people built the foundations of urban living we still rely on. Because even in an age without soap or science, they understood a simple truth: civilization begins where cleanliness does. And that's something worth holding your nose and your respect for. Morning mist drifts through the market square as you stroll past stalls bursting with color. Scarlet cloth, deep violet ribbons, shining gold, threaded trims. They shimmer in the light like treasure. But there's something curious here. The crowd moves cautiously around the merchant, selling those fabrics, their eyes hungry, but their hands hesitant. You soon realize why. Most of them aren't allowed to wear what they're admiring. Welcome to the strange and fascinating world of sumptuary laws. The medieval rules that dictated what people could and could not wear based on their rank, income, and even morality. You might think fashion was just personal taste, but in the Middle Ages, it was politics stitched into fabric. Every thread told the world who you were, or who you weren't supposed to be. It all started with the fear of pretending. When merchants and townsfolk began to get rich, nobles panicked. How would anyone tell who was truly important if everyone started dressing like them? So, kings across Europe issued it spelling out who could wear what. A noble could wear ermine fur, a merchant could not. Silk was for the upper class, linen for commoners, and heaven help you if you wore purple without permission. It could be a crime. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about preserving class distinction or about keeping luxury trades under royal control. Probably both. Power always hides behind good intentions, after all. Picture a law clerk, ink, stained and wary, carefully recording fines. Thomas Weaver, guilty of wearing gold lace, to pay 4 shillings and forfeit the garment. The irony. Tailors loved the laws. Every new rule meant more demand for legal fashion, cleverly modified trims, dyed cloths that imitated band hues, secret silk linings hidden beneath plain wool. Humans, as ever, found ways to bend the rules without breaking them. You stop near a dressmaker's booth where a young woman runs her fingers over a bolt of deep crimson cloth. The merchant leans in and whispers, "Only a countess could wear this." She sighs, glancing at the pale brown fabric she can afford. And you can almost feel her frustration. The longing to look beautiful, to be seen, to step for a moment beyond the limits of her birth. It wasn't just about color. Length, trim, and decoration all carried rules. A man's tunic could only fall to a certain point, depending on his class. Too long, and he'd be mocked, or punished, for ping the gentry. Women's veils, too, were restricted. Unmarried women wore plain white, while married ladies might wear embroidered gold edges. Fashion became language, and everyone was fluent in what it meant. Even shoes weren't safe. In the 14th century, the trend of palaines, those ridiculously long, pointy shoes, spread through Europe. Nobles wore tips so long they had to be tied to their knees. Naturally, the church was horrified. Sermons thundered that such footwear symbolized pride, vanity, and the devil's horns. Soon, laws decreed that commoners' shoes couldn't have points longer than 2 inches. Because clearly, holiness began at the ankle. But here's the twist. Sometimes these rules protected people. Expensive dyes like Tyrian purple or crimson came from toxic substances like mercury and lead. By limiting access, the laws may have accidentally saved common folk from slow poisoning So yes, for once, weird medieval regulations might have had a really good reason. Still, most of it came down to status anxiety. Rulers wanted to keep the hierarchy visible at all times. A lord's daughter shouldn't be mistaken for a baker's. A wealthy merchant shouldn't be mistaken for a knight. Clothing was a uniform of order in a world terrified of chaos. And, as usual, the church added its own twist, morality through modesty. Bright colors and fancy embroidery were temptations of the flesh. Women were warned not to paint their faces like Jezebel, or adorn themselves in devil's cloth. So while noblewomen dripped in jewels, peasant girls were told virtue shone brighter than silk. A spoiler: it didn't sparkle nearly as well in candlelight. You pause at a fountain where two old women gossip about a local scandal. A miller's wife who dared wear velvet to mass. Imagine, one huffs. Her husband's not even landed. The other shakes her head. Pride goeth before the fine. Their laughter echoes through the square, and you can't help but smile. Fashion policing, it seems, is as old as humanity itself. In some kingdoms, like England under Edward III, the laws were exhaustive. There were pages upon pages detailing what each social class could wear, from servants to knights, widows to priests. Even wedding attire was controlled. Brides from modest families couldn't wear jeweled girdles or more than one silk ribbon in their hair. And yet, royal courts were fashion explosions. Queens imported lace, pearls, and gold thread from Venice, flaunting wealth under the very nose of the church. Hypocrisy, after all, never goes out of style. Historians still argue whether these laws truly changed people's behavior. Many believe they did the opposite, fueled desire. When something is forbidden, it becomes irresistible. Tailors made fortunes selling legal fakes. Linen dyed to look like silk. Tin jewelry painted gold, furs dyed to imitate ermine. The medieval version of designer knockoffs. But every now and then, these rules sparked rebellion. In Florence, young artisans deliberately wore flashy colors as a form of protest. In London, tradesmen's guilds petitioned for the right to wear finer fabrics, arguing their success deserved recognition. And by the 15th century, fashion was becoming unstoppable, a force even kings couldn't fully contain. You step into a candle-lit hall where a noble feast is underway. The air hums with laughter, music, and rustling silk. Each guest gleams in their permitted finery, an orchestra of fabrics playing social rank like musical notes. Servants in rough wool glide between tables, invisible yet essential. You catch one girl glance down at her patched apron, and then at the Duchess's velvet gown. And in that single look, you see the whole medieval system. Order, envy, aspiration, and rebellion all stitched together in human hearts. Maybe that's the quiet truth beneath all those rules. Fashion isn't just about vanity. It's about identity. And identity, no matter the century, is power. As the feast continues, a minstrel sings of lovers who trade clothes to escape their fates. The crowd laughs, but the story carries a whisper of defiance. The dream that a simple change of dress could change your destiny. The candles burn lower. The Duchess rises, her gown shimmering like dawn, her jewels catching every eye. Behind her, a servant girl sweeps the floor, her plain brown hem brushing the same stone. And for a fleeting second, you imagine her wondering how it might feel to wear gold. The music fades, leaving only the rustle of silk and the whisper of dreams too bright for law to silence. The dawn bell tolls across the mist-draped valley, echoing from the monastery walls like a heartbeat made of bronze. You're standing at the edge of a cloister garden, dew shining on the grass, the air, carrying the faint scent of thyme and beeswax. A monk passes by, his sandals whispering against the flagstones. He doesn't greet you. He can't. He has taken the vow of silence. Inside these stone walls, the world slows until every breath feels deliberate. Words are rationed, spoken only when absolutely necessary. You sense the hush wrapping around everything. The rustle of robes, the scratch of quills, the flutter of sparrows near the window arches. In a world obsessed with noise and hierarchy, silence itself was a radical rule. Monks believed that speech wasted spiritual energy. Every word risked vanity, anger, or gossip. Silence, by contrast, turned the soul inward, letting it hear God more clearly. So monasteries developed elaborate systems to live without speaking. Hand signs replaced conversations, one for bread, another for wine, another for pass the ink. Historians still argue whether these gestures were formalized languages or just evolved from kitchen shortcuts. But they were incredibly efficient. Imagine sitting at the refectory table during breakfast. Dozens of men eat in absolute quiet, while one brother reads scripture aloud. No chatter. No clinking plates beyond necessity. Someone raises 2 fingers, a signal for more water. Another touches his lips, asking for salt. Meals become choreography, each movement precise. Of course, silence didn't mean peace. Inside each man's mind, thoughts raced. Distractions buzzed. That was the real challenge. The rules weren't just about keeping mouths closed. They were about training the mind to stop wandering. You begin to realize that the hardest noise to silence isn't external. It's your own thoughts. In some orders, like the Carthusians, silence was near total. They spoke only once a week, on Sundays, during brief recreation walks through the gardens. Imagine holding your tongue for 6 days straight, saving up small sentences like treasures. The first words on Sunday must have felt like sunlight after long winter darkness. Yet there was beauty in it. Without words, the monks learned to read moods through eyes, gestures, the rhythm of breathing. Compassion grew in subtler ways. One glance could replace an apology. A shared smile could forgive a dozen small irritations. You follow the monks into the scriptorium, where they copy manuscripts. The only sounds are the steady scratching of quills and the occasional sigh. Hours pass like minutes. In this hush, concentration becomes a kind of prayer. The whole room feels suspended between 2 heartbeats of eternity. Still, not everyone loved the silence. Some monks found it oppressive, even maddening. Historians still argue whether the vow caused psychological strain or offered genuine serenity. There are letters from abbots begging for leniency during times of stress, famines, plagues, or wars, because the brothers needed words to comfort each other. When silence broke, it often burst forth as laughter, songs, or debates, reminding everyone that these were still human beings, not saints carved in stone. And, naturally, rules led to loopholes. Monks invented clever ways to speak without technically speaking. Some whispered in the choir stalls, claiming they were chanting. Others wrote notes on scraps of parchment. A few even coughed in rhythmic patterns that supposedly carried meaning. Where there are rules, there's always creativity. The church saw silence as discipline, but the monks often discovered it was also a mirror. Without conversation, you hear your inner voice unfiltered. Old regrets resurface, pride reveals itself, doubts whisper from corners of the mind. To endure silence was to face yourself. As the day unfolds, you wander through the cloister corridors. Sunlight spills through arched windows, painting the floor in lattices of gold. A novice kneels, polishing brass candlesticks. He hums quietly, a forbidden sound, and immediately catches himself, pressing his lips shut, eyes wide with guilt. You give him a small nod, and he smiles faintly, relieved. Even within the strictest rule, compassion finds space to breathe. The abbot, a tall man with silvered beard, glides past. He carries a small tablet etched with wax, his tool for brief written orders. When he erases a line with his thumb, you realize how temporary communication here must feel. Words literally vanish once used. At midday, bells summon the brothers to prayer. They move like one body, silent but synchronized. Each bow, each crossing of the chest, each kneel is a wordless sentence in a conversation with heaven. The chapel hums with breath and devotion. You feel it in your chest, a vibration deeper than sound. Later, in the garden, you watch a monk tend to herbs, rosemary for remembrance, sage for cleansing, lavender for calm. He plucks a leaf, rubs it between his fingers, then releases the fragrance into the air. No explanation needed. The gesture speaks volumes. The silence here is not emptiness, it's structure. Every absence of speech becomes a frame for awareness. You hear the soft drip of water from a fountain, the wings of a passing bird, your own heartbeat, slowing to match the rhythm of monastic life. There's an old saying carved above the door of one abbey: "In silence, you shall find the word." It's ironic, perhaps, that by denying speech, monks hope to understand divine language. But you begin to see the truth in it. Without noise, everything else gains clarity. Night descends, and candles flicker along the hallways. A final procession of hooded figures glides through the cloister, each carrying a taper. They bow before the altar, extinguish their flames, and vanish into individual cells. Soon, the monastery is swallowed in a silence so complete you can almost feel it pressing gently against your ears. You linger in the dark courtyard, watching stars bloom above the bell tower. No voice disturbs the air, and in that stillness, you sense the strange gift hidden inside all those rules, not punishment, but peace. The world outside the monastery never stops chattering. Markets shouting, lords arguing, minstrels singing. But within these walls, humanity learned how to listen. You exhale softly, realizing that perhaps the medieval vow of silence wasn't about shutting out sound. It was about creating space for the sacred whisper inside every living soul. Dawn creeps over the damp fields as you make your way toward a timber palisade surrounding a small medieval village. Smoke curls lazily from thatched roofs, and a rooster crows somewhere behind the churchyard wall. The place looks peaceful enough, until you notice the guards at the gate, checking everyone who enters. One man is turned away for wearing a tunic that's far too fine for his rank. The sumptuary laws strike again. In the medieval world, appearance wasn't just fashion. It was identity, morality, and law rolled into one itchy woolen package. You couldn't simply wear what you liked. You had to wear what society told you. These weird clothing rules weren't about modesty or taste. They were about keeping everyone in their proper place. Picture this. You're a successful merchant, flush with coin from the wool trade. You've just bought a beautiful silk doublet from Italy, embroidered with tiny gold threads. But when you step into town wearing it, people gasp. A local officer finds you immediately. Silk is reserved for nobles, even if you can afford it. you're breaking the social order by dressing above your station. Historians still argue whether these laws were really enforced or mostly symbolic posturing by the elite. But there's no doubt they reflected an obsession with visual hierarchy. You had to look like who you were supposed to be. The church even supported these rules. Preachers warned that flashy clothing led to sin. One sermon claimed, "The devil weaves vanity into every golden thread." That's quite the review for medieval fashion. Yet behind the strictness, there was logic. In a world without ID cards or databases, clothing was your status card. A man in fur was rich. A man in linen was respectable. A man in plain wool might be a peasant or monk. These instant visual cues kept order in markets, courts, and feasts. You stroll through the muddy street, watching the people pass. A blacksmith's wife wears a coarse apron, patched at the seams. A knight struts by in gleaming mail, his cloak trimmed with rabbit fur. Humble, but legal for his rank. Then you spot a young woman whose gown shimmers faintly in the sun. The guard frowns. She hurries into a doorway, hiding her forbidden silk cuffs. Medieval fashion was a code, and breaking it was risky. In England, for instance, laws under Edward III listed which fabrics and colours each class could wear. Only royalty could wear purple, since the dye came from rare Mediterranean snails and cost a fortune. Nobles could wear fur like ermine or sable. Merchants could wear lesser furs, rabbit, maybe cat if they were feeling fancy. Peasants, they got wool and maybe linen if harvests were kind. But humans being humans, everyone tried to cheat. Tailors developed clever tricks, cheaper dyes mimicking royal shades. Linings of forbidden fabric hidden beneath plain outer layers. Think of it as medieval fashion smuggling. You stop by a booth where a dyer stirs a cauldron of deep red cloth. He lowers his voice and says, "It's cochineal from Spain. Too fine for most folks, but who's checking?" He winks. Even under strict rules, markets found loopholes. Still, for some, these restrictions made life miserable. Imagine being a widow with a bit of inheritance. You finally have enough to buy something beautiful, but the law says beauty belongs only to those born to it. That's not just about fabric, that's about power. Even priests had their own attire codes. A cleric could be punished for dressing too worldly. Yet ironically, bishops sometimes paraded in robes so glittering they made kings jealous. The hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed. Chroniclers occasionally mocked high, ranking clergy as peacocks of paradise. There's a curious story from Florence, where the government hired inspectors called Officiali del Don. Literally, officials of the women. Their job? To walk the streets and measure sleeves, necklaces, and shoe lengths, ensuring women weren't wearing too much gold or lace. You'd think they'd have better things to do. But apparently, sleeve circumference was a matter of civic order. And while men faced rules, women bore the brunt. Lace too intricate, illegal. Veil too sheer, sinful. Even widows were told what colours they could wear, and for how long. Usually black or grey for at least a year, sometimes longer. Breaking mourning rules could get you labelled immoral. Yet amid all this control, something fascinating happened. People turned fashion into rebellion. The more authorities clamped down, the more creativity flourished. Peasants might embroider secret patterns inside their collars. Merchants wore hidden jewelry. Subtle defiance stitched into every seam. Historians still argue whether these small acts of resistance contributed to the rise of individuality in later centuries. When you couldn't say who you were through speech or power, maybe clothing became your quiet protest. In the cold air of the village square, you spot a young squire polishing his boots. He mutters about how his lord forbids him from wearing a feather in his cap. Until he's knighted. It's just a feather, he grumbles, not a crown. You can't help but smile. Every age has its fashion rebels. By evening, torches flicker along the wooden street. The villagers gather for a festival, dancing beneath ribbons and lanterns. Suddenly, all those strict lines blur. A noblewoman's jeweled shoes are hidden by mud. A farmer's daughter twirls, and for a moment, her coarse skirt catches the light like silk. In the glow of firelight, no one can tell rank from rags. That's the secret the laws never accounted for. The human need to express, to blur boundaries, to look beautiful no matter what the rules say. Later, as you sit by the edge of the fire, a minstrel plucks his lute and sings. The lord in velvet, the peasant in wool. Each feels the wind and the winter's pull. What worth is silk when skin feels cold? We're all the same when the night takes hold. The villagers laugh, clap, and toss coins at his feet. You realize that for all the pomp and regulation, clothing couldn't truly separate people. It could only disguise how similar they really were. And as the last song fades, you find yourself thinking, maybe the weirdest rule of all was the one that tried to stop people from simply being themselves. The morning mist hangs over the meadow like pale silk as you follow a narrow dirt path leading to a lonely manor perched on a hill. The fields are quiet now, but something about this place feels heavy. Like every stone remembers the rules once carved into its people's lives. You've journeyed through curfews, vows, punishments, and peculiar customs. Yet here, in this last stretch, everything folds together. You start to see how these strange laws weren't random. They were survival maps for a world that didn't yet trust chaos. Inside the manor's hall, a fire burns low in the hearth. The steward, thin and anxious, is reading from a long parchment. A list of household ordinances. No gambling after Vespers. No servant may taste the Lord's wine. No woman may light more than one candle in her chamber. Even in private homes, order ruled. Every act, from how you dined to when you slept, existed within an invisible framework of do's and don'ts. And yet, the more you listen, the more it becomes clear. These weren't all punishments. Many weird medieval rules actually made sense, at least back then. The don't bathe too often rule. Not ignorance, but practicality. Bathhouses were often disease traps or social scandals. The don't eat meat on Fridays rule. It conserved livestock and gave trade to fishermen. The no loud noises after complaint. It let people sleep in cramped towns where thin walls carried every sound. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly obsessed with regulation or simply surrounded by necessity. Life was fragile. Fires, famines, plagues, and structure kept panic at bay. In a world without modern medicine or government stability, rules were the only thing that felt safe. You glance at the steward's face as he drones on, realizing that this constant obedience wasn't just about fear, it was identity. To follow rules was to belong. To break them was to invite chaos, shame, or exile. People lived not as individuals, but as moving pieces of a moral machine, each cog turning because it must. But you also remember what you've seen along your journey, monks whispering under vows of silence, bakers carving secret marks on their loaves, villagers hiding silk beneath plain wool. Everywhere, humans bent the rules, just enough to feel alive. It's strange, isn't it? The same people who feared God's wrath also loved laughter, wine, and mischief. For every statute carved into oak, there was a wink across the marketplace, or a prayer, whispered just a bit too loudly. You wander outside the manor and gaze across the fields. The sun breaks through the mist, painting everything gold. Birds scatter from a hedgerow, startled by your steps. You breathe in the cool air, and suddenly, the whole medieval world seems to stretch around you again. The bells from the monastery, the clang of the blacksmith's forge, the laughter from the tavern, the quiet prayers of the sick. You realize that these weird rules were never about control alone. They were how people made sense of mystery. When storms ruined crops, they saw God's message. When a candle guttered at night, they crossed themselves. When the plague came, they built rituals to protect their hearts, if not their bodies. Every custom, however strange, was a kind of comfort blanket against the unknown. And then, as the wind shifts, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wild thyme, you feel a kind of affection for them, the people who lived by rules we'd now find ridiculous. They weren't foolish. They were improvising, because even now, centuries later, we still make rules for the same reasons. We still build systems to feel safe, invent rituals to ward off chaos, argue about what's proper. The clothes and candles may have changed, but the heart hasn't. You walk further along the path until the manor fades behind you. The road winds through tall grass, and the horizon glows faintly with the promise of dawn. In the quiet, you hear echoes, church bells, laughter, footsteps fading into time. You wonder how many of those long, forgotten voices once thought their world was modern, sensible, eternal. You wonder what of our rules will look just as strange one day. The world turns. The rules change, but the need for meaning, the longing to make sense of it all, never disappears. And as you think that, you realize this bedtime journey was never really about medieval laws. It was about the people behind them, the dreamers, the fearful, the practical, the rebellious, the ones who made order out of uncertainty, who found peace in structure, who left behind a strange but beautiful pattern of life. You stop walking and look back one last time. The mist is rising, and the land lies open and endless. Maybe that's the real lesson, even in a world bound by rules. The human spirit keeps finding its own quiet freedom. And now, take a slow breath. Let the centuries fall away like dust from old pages. The clang of the blacksmith, the hum of monks, the whispers of forbidden love and laughter, all fading into the distance. The medieval night grows still, the torches burn low, and the great wheel of time turns softly beneath your feet. You're no longer in the hall, or the monastery, or the muddy village square. You're just here, breathing, listening, feeling that strange mix of wonder and calm that comes from knowing people have always been a little weird, a little brave, and always searching for order in a noisy world. The wind that rustles through the reeds outside your window tonight. Maybe it's the same breeze that once stirred the cloaks of knights, or carried the scent of herbs from a nun's garden. The past isn't gone. It just speaks in whispers now. So, as your eyes grow heavier, let those whispers settle into you. Let the world shrink to the quiet rhythm of your breath. Tomorrow will bring its own strange rules, its own quiet rebellions. But for now, you can rest, warm, safe, and timeless. Good night, traveler of history. Sleep well beneath the soft echo of old bells. Sweet dreams.